In June of 1981, in the rolling red clay hills of Chatham County, North Carolina, Arthur Pearsall made a decision. He was 71 years old, a man whose age was written not in the stoop of his back, but in the deliberate, unhurried economy of his movements. The decision concerned a piece of land known locally, and with a certain degree of derision, as the North 40. It was not a field. It was a scar. The 40 acres had been clear-cut for pulpwood in 1957 by a timber company from out of state. They had taken the loblolly pines and the mature oaks, leaving behind a battlefield of stumps, tangled slash, and deeply rutted soil. For 24 years, nature had tried to reclaim it, but its attempt was chaotic and hostile. Sweet gum and poplar saplings grew in dense, worthless thickets. Kudzu vines, like a green pestilence, smothered everything they touched. Blackberry and saw greenbrier formed impenetrable walls of thorns. The stumps, hundreds of them, remained. They were mostly pine, their resinous hearts refusing to rot, their sprawling root systems locking the earth in a wooden grip. Arthur had owned the land his entire life. It had been his father's before him. He had watched the logging operation with a quiet sense of loss, a transaction his father had made out of necessity in a lean year. He had watched it fester for more than 2 decades, an unproductive blight on his otherwise tidy, self-sufficient 200-acre farm. The rest of his land was a patchwork of hayfields, a small pasture for his dozen Hereford cows, a well-tended woodlet, and the bottomland where he grew enough corn to feed his animals through the winter. The North 40 was the exception. It was dead on the land ledger, a daily reminder of a wound that had not healed. Others had tried to tame similar parcels in the county. The methods were known, and they were all brutal and expensive. One neighbor, 5 years prior, had hired a man with a Caterpillar D8 bulldozer to clear 20 acres of cutover. The machine had roared for a week, pushing stumps into massive piles that were then doused with diesel and set ablaze. The black smoke a funeral pyre for the topsoil. The dozer had scraped the land bare, mixing the thin layer of humus with the sterile clay beneath. The cost had been staggering, nearly $4,000, and the resulting field was a hard-pan desert that grew more poverty grass than fescue. The neighbor eventually gave up and planted it back in pines, a 30-year investment just to get back to where he started. The community had accepted such land as lost. It was a feature of the landscape, like a creek or a rock outcropping. It was land you drove past, land you hunted rabbits on, but not land you farmed. It was a problem without an affordable, practical solution. The common wisdom, spoken over coffee at the Siler City Diner and over sacks of feed at the co-op, was to leave it alone. To fight, it was to waste money and break your back for nothing. Arthur Pearsall, however, had decided the time had come. He was not a man who acted on impulse. This decision had been germinating for years, a slow seed of an idea planted long ago. He stood at the edge of the property line, marked by a sagging, rust-eaten barbed wire fence, and looked out over the chaos. His eyes, pale blue and accustomed to judging distance and weather, did not see a hopeless tangle. He saw a system. He saw a problem of leverage and biology. He saw the work ahead, and he was not deterred. He did not need a bulldozer. He did not need chemicals. He had a different plan, one rooted in a time before diesel engines and agricultural chemistry. The first sign of his intentions came not with the roar of machinery, but with the quiet, rhythmic thud of a post-hole digger. He drove his 1952 Ford 8-inch tractor, its red and gray paint faded to a soft patina, to the edge of the North 40. The tractor was as old and reliable as he was. He had rebuilt its engine twice, knew the specific whine of its hydraulics, the exact tension of its clutch. He hitched up a single-bottom plow and spent a day clearing a 5-foot-wide fire break just inside the property line, turning over the soil to expose the red clay, a line drawn against the wilderness. Then he began setting the posts. They were black locust, harvested from his own woodlet years before and seasoned under the cover of his hay barn. Locust was a wood that defied rot, a natural steel that could stand in the ground for 50 years. He did not use a powered auger. He used his father's old post-hole digger, a tool of simple, heavy steel and fire-hardened hickory handles worn smooth by 2 generations of hands. The work was slow and methodical. He would drive the clamshell blades into the earth, use his body weight to shear the soil, and lift the tool, depositing a neat cylinder of clay beside the hole. 2 feet deep, 10 feet apart. Each thud of the digger was a statement of purpose. This activity did not go unnoticed. His nearest neighbor, a man named Henderson who farmed 300 acres with new John Deere equipment, watched from his pickup truck one afternoon. He saw the old man working alone, digging holes by hand along the edge of the useless land. Henderson shook his head, a gesture of pity mixed with disbelief. He told the men at the feed store the next Saturday. "Arthur Pearsall's lost his mind," Henderson announced, leaning against a stack of sweet feed. "He's fencing in the North 40. By hand." A murmur of agreement went through the small group of farmers. They all knew that land. They all knew Arthur. He was a good man, a quiet man, but he was old. Maybe his age had finally caught up to him. "Fencing it for what?" someone asked. "Ain't enough grass in there to keep a goat alive." "No idea," Henderson said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "But he's working out there like he's got a deadline. 71 years old. It's a sad thing to see." The consensus in the store was that it was a foolish, sentimental project. A way for an old man to keep busy, perhaps. But it was not serious farming. It was a waste of good locust posts and a perfectly good back. A week later, David Caldwell, the new county extension agent, paid a visit. Caldwell was 26, a recent graduate of North Carolina State University with a degree in agricultural science. He was earnest, ambitious, and believed firmly in the power of data, soil tests, and university-approved methods. He drove a new white Ford Ranger with the county seal on the door. He carried a stainless steel soil probe and a clipboard. He had heard the talk at the feed store and decided to make a courtesy call to offer some professional guidance and gently steer the old farmer away from his folly. He found Arthur's stretching wire. Arthur had unrolled a 330-foot spool of heavy-gauge woven wire, the kind used for hogs and cattle. He had it clamped in a chain-link fence stretcher attached to the bumper of his Ford 8N. With the tractor in low gear, he was slowly tightening the wire, pulling it taut between 2 sturdy corner posts he had braced with diagonal beams. The wire hummed with tension, the sound sharp and clear in the humid air. Caldwell got out of his truck, his new work boots crunching on the gravel shoulder. "Mr. Pearsall," he called out. Arthur turned, his expression unreadable. He nodded. He finished securing the wire to the post with heavy staples, his hammer blows precise and unhurried, then shut off the tractor's engine. The sudden silence was filled with the buzz of insects. "David Caldwell," the young man said, extending a hand. "New county agent. Just wanted to stop by and introduce myself. Heard you were starting a new project out here." Arthur shook his hand. His grip was firm, his palm as tough as leather. "Putting up a fence," Arthur said. It was a statement of fact, not an invitation for conversation. Caldwell gestured with his clipboard toward the tangled mess of the North 40. "Mind if I ask what the plan is? The soil in these cut-over tracks is usually pretty poor. High acidity, low in organic matter. We did a survey of this whole section a few years back." "I know the soil," Arthur said. Undeterred, Caldwell pressed on, adopting the patient tone he used for explaining complex ideas to stubborn, old-fashioned farmers. "Well, I ran the numbers based on the county survey data and the current cost for land clearing. To get this land productive, you'd be looking at a significant investment. Bulldozer work to get the stumps out, that's at least $150 an acre right there. Then you need to disc it deep, which is tough with the root mat. And the soil amendments, you need at least 2 tons of lime per acre to get the pH up to a reasonable level. Plus nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. You're probably looking at a total cost of over $10,000 to reclaim this parcel. And even then, your first few years of yield would be marginal at best." He paused, letting the weight of the numbers sink in. He looked at Arthur, expecting a look of shock or dismay. Arthur's expression did not change. He looked at the fence, then back at Caldwell. "The university's recommendation for land like this," Caldwell continued, his voice softening with practiced sympathy, "is usually a long-term timber investment. You could get cost sharing from the state to plant it in loblolly pine. In 25 or 30 years, you'd have a marketable stand. It's the most economically sound approach. Arthur looked out over the land. He saw the sweet gum saplings and the gnarled pine stumps. He looked at the young man with his clipboard and his confident, unearned knowledge. "I am to have a crop on it next year," Arthur said quietly. Caldwell could not hide his surprise. He let out a short, involuntary laugh, which he quickly tried to stifle. "Next year? Mr. Pearsall, with all due respect, that's just not possible. Not without the kind of capital investment I was talking about. This land needs to be mechanically and chemically remediated. It's a multi-year process." "I have a different method," Arthur said. He turned and picked up his hammer, his signal that the conversation was over. Caldwell stood for a moment, nonplussed. He had come to help, to offer the benefits of modern agricultural science. He was being dismissed. He saw an old man, stubborn and set in his ways, embarking on a project doomed to fail. It was a shame. "Well, sir," Caldwell said, retreating to his truck, "my office is always open if you change your mind or need a soil test kit. Good luck to you." Arthur nodded once, without looking at him. He watched the white truck drive away, kicking up a plume of red dust. He was not angry. He was not offended. He had expected nothing less. The young man saw numbers on a clipboard. He saw cost per acre and tons of lime. He saw a problem to be solved with money and machines. He did not see the land itself. He did not understand the nature of the problem, and so he could never understand the elegance of the solution. Arthur went back to his work. The perimeter fence was only the first step. The real work was inside. He spent the next 3 weeks building cross fences, dividing the 40 acres into 8 5-acre paddocks. The work was arduous. He had to clear paths for the fence lines with a chainsaw and a brush axe, cutting through the dense thickets of saplings and briars. He hit rocks, digging post holes. He fought the tangled kudzu that seemed to grow back overnight. But every evening, he returned to his small, quiet house, ate a simple meal, and slept the deep, dreamless sleep of a man engaged in meaningful labor. As he worked, his mind often drifted back to his father, Thomas Pearsall. His father had been a man of even fewer words than Arthur, a man who communicated through action and quiet demonstration. He had farmed through the Great Depression, through droughts and floods, and had held on to his land when many others had lost theirs. He possessed a deep, intuitive knowledge of the natural world, a knowledge that had been passed down through generations of Pearsalls who had worked this same red soil. Arthur remembered being a boy, maybe 10 years old, standing with his father at the edge of a 5-acre plot that looked much like the North 40. It had been logged for firewood during the war, and the family needed to turn it into a new pasture. Arthur had asked his father how they could ever clear such a mess. Thomas Pearsall had crouched down and picked up a handful of the soil. It was thin and pale. He crumbled it in his calloused fingers. "The land is tired," he had said. It was one of the few times Arthur had ever heard him describe the land with a human emotion. "But it ain't dead. You can't force land like this. You have to persuade it." He pointed to a large pine stump. "That's not the real problem," he said. "That's just the part you can see. The real problem is under the ground. A web of roots. That's what's holding everything together in a knot. A plow will just break on it. A dozer would tear up the good soil getting to it. You need something that wants to go after the roots. Something that's designed for the job." And then he had explained the principle, a piece of wisdom so simple and profound that it had stayed with Arthur for 60 years. "A hog," his father had said, "is a plow with a mind of its own. He works for his keep, and he's thorough. He don't just turn the soil. He cultivates it. He finds every grub, every root, every nut. He'll eat the roots of these briars and saplings. He'll dig around these stumps looking for grubs until he exposes the taproot. He'll fertilize as he goes. You just have to put him in a small enough space that he gets the job done right before you move him to the next 1 inch." That was the method. It was not a secret, but it was knowledge that had been forgotten, replaced by the promise of horsepower and chemistry. It was a system that worked with nature, not against it. It used an animal's inherent instinct to solve a human problem. In his barn, in a dusty wooden crate, Arthur kept his father's old farm ledgers. They were bound in worn black leather, the pages filled with his father's neat, spare handwriting. He pulled one out, dated 1946. He found the entry for the 5-acre pasture. His father had recorded everything. Fenced the 5 acres. Used 8 Tamworth gilts and 1 boar. Turned them in May 15th. Fed 1 bushel corn daily to supplement forage. Rotated them out October 20th. Pulled 47 stumps with mule team. Took 2 days. Disked and planted winter rye. Hogs gained average 150 pounds. It was all there. The breed of pig, Tamworth. A hardy, ginger-red heritage breed known for its ability to thrive on pasture and in woodlands, a pig not yet bred into lazy submission by confinement farming. The timing, the stocking density, the outcome. This was not a gamble. It was a proven technique, a piece of generational knowledge recorded on brittle, yellowed paper. By late June, the fences were complete. The 40 acres were neatly partitioned. In the center of the property, near a small, spring-fed creek that trickled through a gully, Arthur built a simple loading chute and a holding pen. He then constructed 8 small, movable A-frame shelters from scrap lumber and tin roofing, 1 for each paddock. He ran a line of black polyethylene pipe from the spring to a series of water troughs, ensuring a constant supply of fresh water. The infrastructure was complete. It was plain, functional, and built to last. The men at the co-op now had more to talk about. The fences were undeniable. He's divided it up into little pens, Henderson reported one Saturday. Looks like he's getting ready to run livestock in there. Still don't know what he thinks they're going to eat. Maybe he's raising goats, another man offered. Goats eat briars. Goats will climb that fence, came the reply. And they won't do a thing about them stumps. The speculation was a source of endless amusement. No one could fathom the logic behind Arthur's labor. It ran counter to everything they understood about modern farming. In the first week of July, a livestock truck rumbled down the dirt road to Arthur's farm. It backed up to the new loading chute. Arthur and the driver, using sorting boards, unloaded 32 pigs. They were Tamworths, sourced from a breeder in the mountains of Virginia who still raised the old lines. They were not the pale, fleshy pigs of a commercial hog farm. These were athletes. They were lean, long snout, and covered in coarse, reddish-gold hair. They moved with an energetic curiosity, their ears pricked, their intelligent eyes taking in their new surroundings. There were 30 young sows, or gilts, and 2 boars. Arthur opened the gate to the first 5-acre paddock. The pigs hesitated for a moment, then poured into the enclosure, their snouts already to the ground. They began to root almost immediately, their powerful neck muscles driving their noses into the leaf litter and soft earth. They were not just eating, they were exploring, digging, turning over rocks, and tearing at roots with an instinctual fervor. Arthur watched them for a long time, a quiet satisfaction settling over him. The engine of his land-clearing machine was now running. It was a living, breathing, self-replicating engine that ran on acorns, roots, and a little corn. He began his daily routine. Each morning, he would drive the Ford 8N down to the paddock, a few buckets of shelled corn in the front loader. He did not feed them much, just enough to keep them interested and to supplement the meager forage. He called it encouragement. The corn was a treat that focused their energy. They knew he was the source of it, and they would come running to his call. But as soon as the corn was gone, they would return to their real work, the relentless tilling of the soil. The first paddock was a scene of what, to an outsider, looked like pure destruction. The pigs were systematic. They first cleared the undergrowth, eating the leaves and tender shoots of the saplings and briars. Then they began to dig. They unearthed and devoured the starchy roots of the kudzu and greenbrier. They found pockets of grubs and earthworms, aerating the soil as they went. They used their snouts like levers, prying up rocks and smaller stumps. The ground was transformed into a lumpy, churned-up expanse of red earth, dotted with the larger, more stubborn stumps. David Caldwell drove by a few weeks later. He slowed his truck and stared. The sight confirmed his worst fears. The land was being utterly ruined. It looked like it had been bombed. The old man was not just wasting his time. He was actively degrading the land, causing massive soil erosion. He considered stopping, trying once more to reason with Arthur, but he decided against it. The man was a lost cause. Caldwell shook his head and drove on, making a mental note to use this as a case study in his next newsletter on the dangers of improper land management. The talk at the diner grew more pointed. Arthur's project had become a local joke. "Looks like a herd of wild boars got loose on his place," one man chuckled over his breakfast. "He's not clearing that land, he's burying it," said another. "One good rain, and all that loose dirt is going to wash right down into the creek." But Arthur knew what he was looking at. He saw past the superficial chaos. He saw the soil being broken up and mixed. He saw the weeds being eradicated at the root level. He saw the pigs concentrating their own manure into the soil, a free and constant source of nitrogen and organic matter. And he saw them beginning their work on the stumps. They would gather around the base of a pine stump, drawn by the insects and grubs that lived in the decaying bark. They would root and dig, following a tasty root deep into the ground. Day after day, they would excavate the soil from around the main roots, exposing them to the air and sun. They would chew on the smaller, softer roots, gradually weakening the stump's anchor to the earth. After 3 weeks, the first paddock was done. The pigs had done all they could. The ground was completely tilled, most of the smaller roots were gone, and the larger stumps stood isolated in bowls of excavated earth. Arthur brought his tractor down, opened the gate to the second paddock, and closed the gate to the first. He called the pigs. They trotted eagerly toward the new, untouched section, ready to begin the process again. Behind them, they left a patch of land that was ready for the next stage. It was rough, but it was clean. Arthur waited for a good rain to settle the soil. Then he hitched his disc harrow to the 8N and drove over the cleared paddock. The discs, which would have been broken or thrown by the dense root mat before, now turned the pig-tilled soil with ease. He made several passes, smoothing the lumpy ground into a workable seedbed. The earth was dark and rich, smelling sweet and alive. It looked nothing like the pale, compacted clay on the other side of the fence. He repeated the process throughout the summer. Every 3 weeks, he moved the pigs to a new paddock. Behind them, he disked the land they had cleared. The work progressed across the North 40 like a slow, creeping tide of order reclaiming chaos. From the road, the transformation became more apparent. A patchwork of cleared, reddish-brown earth began to grow, paddock by paddock, replacing the uniform green of the tangled wilderness. The community's ridicule slowly began to curdle into a grudging curiosity. The sheer scale and progress of the operation were becoming difficult to dismiss. Cars slowed down more often as they passed. Henderson, the skeptical neighbor, stopped his combine on the hill overlooking Arthur's property one afternoon in late August and just watched. He could see the clear demarcation, the untouched jungle, the current paddock where the pigs were a whirlwind of activity, and the series of cleared, disked paddocks that lay waiting. It was still ugly, but there was a pattern to it. There was a method. By mid-October, the pigs had worked their way through all 8 paddocks. The entire 40 acres, with the exception of the largest stumps, was cleared. The briars were gone. The kudzu was gone. The saplings were gone. The soil was tilled and fertilized. The pigs themselves were fat and healthy, having converted the waste vegetation and a little corn into hundreds of pounds of marketable pork. Now came the final stage, the stumps. Arthur walked through the first paddock he had cleared back in July. The stumps, which had once been anchored by a massive network of roots, now stood exposed. Their lateral roots had been chewed away by the pigs and weakened by months of exposure to the elements. They looked like teeth in a diseased gum, ready to be pulled. Arthur got his tractor. He backed the 8N up to one of the larger pine stumps, about 18 inches in diameter. He wrapped a heavy logging chain twice around the base of the stump, then attached it to the tractor's drawbar. He climbed into the seat, pushed the throttle forward, and gently let out the clutch. The 8NS rear tires dug into the soft earth. The chain went taut. The tractor's front wheels lifted slightly off the ground as the engine strained. For a moment, nothing happened. Then there was a sound like a series of pistol shots the sound of thick, resinous roots snapping deep in the ground. The stump shuddered, tilted, and then slowly, with a great sucking noise, it lifted out of the earth. It left behind a deep, conical hole, but the surrounding soil was intact. There was no wide-scale disruption, no scraping away of the topsoil. It was a clean extraction. Arthur dragged the stump to the edge of the field, where he would later cut it up for firewood. He moved to the next one. One by one, the stumps came out. Some of the biggest ones required him to dig a little with a shovel to get the chain around the taproot, but they all yielded. The work his father had done with a team of mules, Arthur was doing with 36 horsepower of well-maintained Detroit steel. The principle, however, was identical. The hard work had already been done by the pigs. This was just the harvest. It took him 2 weeks to pull every stump from the 40 acres. He worked with the same steady, unhurried pace he had applied to every other part of the job. He piled the stumps along the fence line, creating a massive, gnarled wall of wood that would provide fuel for his wood stove for years to come. In the first week of November, David Caldwell was driving home from a farm visit late in the afternoon. His route took him past Arthur Pearsall's place. He had avoided that road for months, embarrassed for the old man and frustrated by his stubbornness. But today, he was running late, and it was the quickest way. As he came over the rise, he glanced over at the North 40, expecting to see the same chaotic, eroded mess he had witnessed in the summer. He pressed the brake. Then he pulled his truck over to the side of the road and shut off the engine. He was looking at a field. It was not a perfect field. It was pocked with the holes where the stumps had been, and it was a deep, raw red. But it was undeniably a field. It was clean. It was open. And along the entire northern edge was a monumental pile of extracted stumps, a testament to the work that had been done. Caldwell got out of his truck and walked to the fence. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth. He could see the distinct lines of the disc harrow across the entire 40 acres. The soil was not the pale, dead-looking clay he had expected. It was dark, crumbly, and rich with what he knew, instinctively, was organic matter. There was no sign of the massive erosion he had predicted. The pig-tilled earth had absorbed the autumn rains like a sponge. He stood there for a long time, leaning on a locust post that Arthur had set by hand. Everything he had learned, everything he had preached, was contradicted by the evidence before his eyes. His spreadsheets had not accounted for this. His textbooks had not offered this solution. He had confidently predicted failure based on sound, scientific principles, and he had been spectacularly, comprehensively wrong. He saw Arthur's old tractor in the distance, slowly pulling a seed drill across the new field. A faint green haze was already visible on the sections Arthur had planted first. The old man was seeding a winter cover crop. Caldwell felt a profound sense of humility. It was a feeling he was not accustomed to. He had come to this community as an expert, an agent of progress. He had pitted Arthur Pearsall. Now, looking at the transformed landscape, he understood that he was the one who had been ignorant. He had seen a problem in terms of inputs and costs. Arthur Pearsall had seen it as a system and had simply applied the right catalyst. The next morning, Caldwell drove his White County truck not past Arthur's farm, but into his driveway. He parked behind the old, rust-free Chevrolet pickup that Arthur drove to town. He walked to the back door of the small farmhouse and knocked. Arthur opened the door. He was holding a cup of coffee. He looked at the young man on his porch and showed no surprise. He simply waited. "Mr. Pearsall," Caldwell began, taking off his hat and holding it in his hands. "I came by to say I was wrong. I saw the field yesterday. I don't understand how you did it, but I was wrong." The admission hung in the air. There was no gloating in Arthur's eyes, no hint of "I told you so." He just nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement. "Pigs," Arthur said, as if that single word explained everything. "I saw the pigs," Caldwell said. "I just didn't understand. I thought they were ruining the land." Arthur took a sip of his coffee. "They were preparing it," he said. He looked at Caldwell, at the genuine confusion and curiosity in the young man's face. He made a decision. "Come on," he said, stepping off the porch. "I'll show you." He led Caldwell not to the newly cleared field, but to his barn. The air inside was cool and smelled of hay and old leather. He walked to the wooden crate and took out his father's 1946 ledger. He opened it on a workbench, the pages fragile as a dead leaf. He pointed to the entry. "My father's method," Arthur said. He learned it from his father. "It's not new. It's just forgotten." Caldwell leaned over the book, reading the spare, elegant script. Tamworth gilts, bushel of corn, pulled stumps with mule team. It was a recipe, a precise, field-tested methodology. "The pigs do the work a machine can't," Arthur explained, his voice low and even. "A bulldozer scrapes the topsoil off to get to the stumps. The pigs till the topsoil and fertilize it while they get to the roots. They don't fight the land. They use what's already there. The briar roots are food. The grubs are food. They turn a problem into a solution. All it costs is some fence, a little corn, and time." He closed the book gently. "You were right about the soil being poor. It was. But you can't fix soil just by dumping a bag of chemicals on it. You have to build it. The pigs did that. They put the life back into it." They walked out to the new field. Arthur bent down and picked up a handful of soil. He held it out for Caldwell to see. It was dark, moist, and aggregated, full of the castings from the earthworms that had followed the pigs. "This is the result," Arthur said. "The cost to clear this land was the price of the pigs and the corn I fed them. I'll sell the pigs next month for more than I paid for them. The stumps are my firewood for the next 10 years. The land is paid for. The math is different when you let the land do the work." Caldwell looked from the rich soil in Arthur's hand to the vast, clean expanse of the 40-acre field. He finally understood. He had been trained to see farming as an industrial process, a battle against nature. Arthur practiced it as a partnership. "Mr. Pearsall," Caldwell said, his voice filled with a newfound respect, "would you mind if I took some notes? I think there are a lot of people who need to learn about this." Arthur gave a slight, almost imperceptible smile. "Nothing to it," he said. "You just have to be willing to listen to what the land is telling you." Over the next few weeks, David Caldwell became a frequent visitor to the Pearsall farm. He was no longer an advisor. He was a student. He filled a notebook with Arthur's quiet wisdom. He learned about the specific qualities of the Tamworth breed. He learned about rotational grazing, about cover crops, about the importance of patience. He took new soil samples from the North 40 and sent them to the lab at the university. When the results came back, he stared at them in disbelief. The organic matter content was nearly 3%, an astonishing figure for a field that had been sterile cut over 6 months before. The pH had risen half a point without a single pellet of lime. The levels of available nitrogen and phosphorus were higher than in many of the county's conventionally managed fields. The data confirmed what his eyes had already told him. Arthur's method was not just effective, it was restorative. Caldwell wrote a report. It was not the kind of report he was used to writing. It contained very little jargon and few references to chemical inputs. Instead, it described, in plain and direct language, the process of biological land reclamation using porcine cultivators. He documented the timeline, the costs, and the results. He attached the soil test data. He submitted it to the State Agricultural Extension Service. His report was initially met with skepticism, but the data was undeniable. A few months later, a soil specialist from the university drove down to see the field for himself. He walked the land with Arthur and a humbled David Caldwell, and he left a convert. The Pearsall method, as it began to be called in Extension Service bulletins, started to gain traction as a viable, low-cost alternative for reclaiming marginal land. The talk at the feed store had changed completely. The jokes were replaced by a quiet, grudging respect. "Did you see the rye on Arthur's new ground?" Henderson said one Saturday, his tone devoid of its former mockery. "It's thick as a carpet, greener than my pasture. Heard he sold them hogs for a pretty penny, too," another man added. Cleared the land and turned a profit at the same time. The North 40 was no longer a symbol of decay. It was a testament to a deeper kind of wisdom. That winter, a young farmer named Ben Carter, whose family owned a piece of cut-over land bordering Arthur's, came to visit. He was in his late 20s, strong and hard-working, but discouraged by the high costs of farming and the low prices for his crops. "Mr. Pearsall," Ben said, standing on the same porch where David Caldwell had made his apology. "I've been watching what you did all year. My dad's got 60 acres just like that one. We always figured it was worthless. I was wondering if you could teach me how you did it." Arthur looked at the young man. He saw the same earnestness he had eventually seen in Caldwell, but this was different. This was the next generation of farmer, a young man with his hands in the same red clay. Arthur went into the house. He came back with his father's 1946 ledger. He held out to Ben. "This is the book," he said, "but the knowledge isn't just in the words. It's in the doing. You come back on Saturday. We'll walk your fence line." And so, the knowledge was passed on. Not in a classroom or a bulletin, but on the land itself, from one generation to the next. The following spring, Arthur plowed under the thick winter rye on the North 40. The green manure, combined with the foundation the pigs had laid, had turned the soil into a rich, dark loam. He planted it in corn. The corn grew with a vigor that stunned the entire county. The stalks were thick and tall, the leaves a deep, healthy green. By August, it stood over 8 feet tall, each stalk bearing 2 large, well-filled ears. When Arthur harvested it that fall, the yield was over 150 bushels per acre, a yield that rivaled the best bottomland in the county. It was a phenomenal success, undeniable and deeply satisfying. The North 40, the scar, the lost land, was now the most productive field on his farm. It had become a symbol, not of folly, but of possibility. It was a quiet rebuke to the idea that progress only came from bigger machines and stronger chemicals. Arthur Pearsall continued to farm for another 10 years. He never expanded. He never went into debt. He lived simply, his life governed by the seasons and the steady rhythms of his work. David Caldwell went on to become a respected voice in sustainable agriculture in the state, and he always began his presentations with the story of an old farmer and his 40 acres of stumps. Ben Carter successfully cleared his family's 60 acres using the Pearsall method and became a prosperous farmer. One cool evening in his 81st year, Arthur stood at the edge of his cornfield, the former North 40. The stalks were dry and rustled in the autumn wind. The harvest was done. He looked out over the land, his land, and felt the deep peace of a problem correctly solved. He thought of his father, and of the pigs, and of the slow, patient work that had brought life back to a tired piece of earth. The land had never been the problem. It had always held the solution. It was just waiting for someone patient enough to listen.